And the only way to allow the market to restructure the Europe in a way that is feasible and viable is to withdraw all the stimulus and let the market function. But you now have a battle between, the people who want more stimulus and those who want austerity, and we'll see how that plays out. But in the United States, you can see the impact of stimulus because it should be so obvious when you look at the crises that have happened in the United States, and it's amazing that Europe wants to follow this example. In fact, you've got Obama is trying to put some pressure on Angela Merkel and others in Europe to provide that stimulus. It's kind of like a kid being a bad influence on his friends. Maybe you got one kid who's trying to convince the other kid to ditch school and go to the beach because it's a lot more fun to go to the beach rather than sitting in a classroom all day. But Europe should resist the temptation to follow America's example because it's a lousy example, and it's an example that has just decimated the U.S. economy.
Agree that we have to go to. What's the spending level we should be at versus where we are?
At a minimum, we shouldn't spend more than we collect in taxes, which means we have to cut about $1.5 trillion out of this year's budget, not over 10 years, in 1 year. And that is massive because, see, right now the government is borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar it spends. It can't do that.
What show today is Steve Keen. Steve is the head of the School of Economics, History, and Politics at Kingston University, and he also pens a popular blog called Steve Keen's Debt Watch. Now, I first asked Steve if he thinks the new Greek finance minister, Mr. Yanis Varoufakis, is a radical, as some have made him out to be. Take a look at what he had to say.
No. Yanis, in economics, because economics is dominated by a mythical vision, which we call neoclassical economics, being radical is pointing out the emperor has no clothes. Yeah, that's the subtitle of my book, Debunking Economics. Yanis has written very similar treatises to mine on that front. And you're a radical when you criticise a delusion. So we're the little boys pointing up saying, Mum, the emperor's naked, he's not wearing anything. And that makes us classified as radical. The radical act is the emperor to be naked in the first place. And that's what unfortunately has happened here. We've let economics get taken over by a sector that doesn't really understand capitalism, has a mythical model of how it's a perfect world and perfect society, ends up causing crises like we're going through now, and then tries to unravel them after and actually makes them worse. Being a radical in economics is being sensible and pragmatic, and that is exactly what Yanis is being.
Now, Yanis's proposal of linking GDP to repayments, it makes it seem like Varoufakis recognizes that principal write-downs, they're non-starters for the Troika right now. But do you think we'll eventually see principal losses on Greek debt?
Well, that comes down to the politics. If they're forced out of the euro, then of course instantly that'll happen. I think it's feasible over time that if Syriza's policies succeed in helping Greece start to grow, then they'll carry on saying, OK, that worked, now let's try the next part of our program. Now, that is saying, well, yes, OK, maybe at some point they'll say they want to have some debt write-downs. Maybe they'll say they want to, certainly when they want to transfer 60% of the debt, which is the Maastricht limit, across to the ECB to back it, that they'll still pay it. That's one that they definitely want to do. We know that. They may come forward and saying debt reductions at some point, only once they prove the success of their program so far. So if they succeed, they may come to debt write-downs. But if they fail because of the Europeans not agreeing to the proposals they're putting forward and then forcing them out of the euro, it won't be their fault that the defaults occur.
Now, the situation in Greece is the worst peacetime economic performance by a developed economy since the Great Depression. And it seems like a textbook case of debt deflation in action. So is this how debt deflation takes hold?
Yeah, unfortunately, and this is again where being ignorant about the very possibility of a debt deflation has led to the problems. To mention one of the experts on the Great Depression, Ben Bernanke, ignored Irving Fisher's debt deflation arguments because he said debt deflation represents, and I quote, no more than a redistribution from one group debtors to another group creditors, and therefore should have no significant macroeconomic effects. That's totally ignorant of the role in which of banks in creating money and destroying it when debt is repaid. paid. So a debt deflation starts off with excessive debt, which leads to people reducing they're trying to pay their debts down, but as they pay their debts down, they are also eliminating money in the economy and causing the economy to spiral down as a result. And then in that situation, you have distress selling, as Fisher argued back in 1933, and the whole thing cascades on top of itself, the only destination being zero, unless there's a countervailing force acting in the opposite direction, which is what the New Deal was under Roosevelt, and what we should be doing now, which is running deficits from the government sector. That's what America's done, and people keep on thinking America's responsible, etc., etc. It is, but it's been responsible by running deficits that are 2 and 3 times the size of the deficits being run in Europe. And in fact, at the peak of the crisis in America, the government deficit there was 15% of GDP, which is 5 times the supposed limit allowed by the Maastricht Treaty. Now, that government spending enabled the private sector to delever without causing a spiral down in the amount of money in the economy. It's not perfect. I'd rather see debt get written off. But that is the only way to prevent a debt deflation, and the Europeans are doing exactly the opposite.
And what about the rest of the periphery? Are they out of the woods yet?
Well, peripheries include Spain, and absolutely not on that front. And of course, Spain is a far larger, I think it's about 5 or 6 times the size of Greece. It's one of Europe's largest economies. And it will be the next one in the firing line. Italy is also looking fragile. France unemployment is running at 12%. And that's, you know, Europe's second largest economy in the EU zone. So the fragility is quite widespread. Even Germany's not doing so well because Germany's success really relied upon people being able to buy its exports and maintain a trade surplus for it. So I think we're well and truly entering the woods, and it's the only way out, ultimately, is to directly address that excessive private debt and start writing it off, which is, of course, not even being talked about in this debate. We're talking totally about Greece's public debt. But those actions to reduce the level of private debt are about the only way out of the woods. Otherwise, we're going to spend a long time wandering around hoping we won't bump into Miss Riding Hood won't bump into the big bad wolf. But the big bad wolf of deflation is definitely out there in the European woods.
And if you had the political cover to fix these problems exactly as they should be dealt with, what would you do?
I would use the state's power to create money, to do what people are now calling helicopter drop money. I call QE for the public, but it's linked that with the creation of the money by the government sector, putting money into people's deposit accounts, tie that to people who are in debt having to reduce their debt. So you use the government money creation capability to cancel private debt while still maintaining the same amount of money in the economy and while benefiting savers as well as debtors, because everybody would get the cash injection, and then write controls on the capacity of banks to lend to finance asset speculation, because that's really where the problem all began, by the banks creating far too much money to finance things like the subprime bubble and the dot-com bubble before that. So limit the capacity for banks to finance speculation, reduce the private debt that's outstanding, admit we made a mistake and cut it back by using the government's money creation capacity, and then after that we can reset ourselves and get back to something like 1950s and 60s America, where the vitality of that economy came partly from its patent generating and innovation and so on, but largely from the growth and demand that was coming out of rising private debt when it was rising from a very small level.
And where are your biggest concerns outside of Greece specifically? You mentioned some, but is it Italy, France, Portugal, where?
Well, Italy and France and Spain are the main concerns right now. But it'll go as far as even as Germany as well, because, as I've argued, even though I'm critical of the level of private debt we've got to, I see an increasing level of private debt as a natural part of a growing economy. That's what helps create a large amount of the money. So you need that demand generated by a rising level of private debt. Now, once you've got to the levels we're at right now, they're so high that nobody wants to borrow money, and that particular force of creative vitality in capitalism disappears, and we get locked in stagnation.
And that was Steve Keen, head of the School of Economics, History, and Politics at Kingston University.